Hi, folks. My name is Shira. Welcome to the Jewish Aces panel. We're going to go through a few things today, starting with a blanket trigger that we'll be talking about sexuality and religion, which means topics might include anti-Semitism or exclusion or rejection due to sexuality. Panelists, if you're going to say something else more specific, just give a trigger before you say it so folks can mute you if they choose to. Yes, so let's start with introductions. So as I said, I'm Shira. I use she, they pronouns. I grew up in a conservative home with a mother as a rabbi and very much rejected that, and then kind of came back around to a more humanistic, secular approach to Judaism. So other panelists, let's introduce ourselves, name, pronouns, and give a little background about your Jewish experience. Nathan, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nathan. They, them pronouns. I identify as ace, and I grew up conservative Jewish, being raised by family that was mostly concerned with Judaism as a cultural tradition, as well as a religion. I still feel more comfortable in conservative Jewish spaces than anywhere else, but I'm also an atheist and a whole bunch of other things that many other Jews are going to be able to relate to.
Kami, Anya, you want to go?
Hi, I'm Kami or Anya. My real name sounds more Jewish, but safety things. My pronouns are they, them. So I also was raised in a conservative house with a mother who's a cantor. Although she gained that a bit before my B'nai Mitzvah. But I grew up in a family where all of my extended family are completely secular. Some of them have completely turned their backs, and my parents recame to Judaism and to conservative Judaism on their own. So we're kind of learning and working with it as I grew up. And I am also somewhere agnostic, or like I find my spirituality within the Jewish community and within the people. But I am conservative in practice. So I keep kosher. I sort of keep Shabbos. And I do keep all of the holidays. And my synagogue is traditional egalitarian, but very, very, very social action, tikkun olam type of community.
Awesome. Last but not least.
Hi, my name is Yael. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as somewhere on the ace spectrum and somewhere on the asexual spectrum, but hetero-romantic. I grew up modern Orthodox. I grew up surrounded by modern Orthodoxy, and I still consider myself modern Orthodox.
Awesome. So we're going to just start with our first question, which is tell us a little bit, if you choose to answer it, about your Jewish educational background, things like Hebrew school, synagogue, and the role that it played in your upbringing, and whether it affected your ability to come to terms with your sexuality. Is anyone interested? Yeah, Kami, why don't you start us?
Okay. So let's see. I grew up with I actually spent third grade in Israel. I grew up with a synagogue that did a Torah club, so I learned to read Torah very early on. And I was part of the USY, United Synagogue Youth, the conservative kind of youth organization. And from 5th grade through 12th grade, I went to Jewish day school. And then I went to Brandeis University, which is a very Jewish university, and actually took a bunch of Near Eastern and Judaic studies courses. So my Judaism is like a core piece of my identity. And I was really lucky, though, that I grew up in a synagogue. I still remember, like, I don't remember if she was a congresswoman or what she was, but a lesbian woman came to talk at our synagogue when I was young. And so I forgot to say I'm gray aroace. And honestly, as a piece of my identity, this was one of the pieces that I came to last. Part of that's also because of the weirdnesses of mine. But it's definitely a thing I've thought about, is how it relates. But then there's a level in which one of the questions that I had always thought I was going to need to answer before I figured out the aceness mixed with my non-binariness was, if I had a partner and had children, how would they be raised? And there's this weird piece of me that's kind of lifted of the I don't have to figure that out the same way. Because in some senses, it doesn't quite have the same way that it matters isn't the right word. But when it comes to my partners, there was a piece of me that always felt guilty if I was dating someone non-Jewish before. And that is something that I don't worry about the same way, as long as they respect my Judaism and my wanting to do all the things. And so mostly it didn't affect my ability, but it has that weird interplay when it comes to who I'm dating, and where I'm meeting people now.
Sure. We had our last panelist join. Do you want to introduce yourself? Sorry.
Hi. You can all hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm Eliza, he, she, her, and I'm a college student and I'm an Orthodox Jew.
Awesome. Thank you. Elise said you wanted to answer the question we were talking about.
Yeah. So I grew up, as I mentioned, completely surrounded by modern Orthodoxy. I went to modern Orthodox schools through college, actually. And I didn't realize that I was asexual until college, because when I was younger, I thought Jews didn't have sex. Sex was not something that was talked about, especially before marriage. So I just thought Jews didn't do it. And when I learned that they did, I thought, oh, like everyone feels the same the same like baseline, whatever about it. I learned that was not true. But I think that in this case, my Judaism actually helped me come to terms with being ace, because I had more time to learn about sexuality on my own. And I wasn't told that it was weird that I wasn't having sex or that I wasn't interested in it. And I was able to learn about things at my own pace and figure things out on my own.
That is interesting. I had never thought of it like that. Nathan or Eliza, do you want to answer?
Sure. I think I had a really different experience from either of you in terms of my Jewish education. So I was raised going to synagogue, and I went to Hebrew school and all this other stuff, but I also went to public school, and I was the only Jew at any of the schools I went to. Like in my everyday day-to-day life, I was basically the only Jewish person there. And I mean that quite literally. When I got to high school, I was the only Jew in my high school. I was the first Jew that many of the other people there had met. So I kind of lived my life split, where I had one life where I was going to Hebrew school and going to synagogue, and I was bar mitzvahed and all of the other stuff. And then I had my other life where I basically didn't interact with anyone on anything Jewish, because there wasn't anyone to interact with on anything. It was just not a thing. And so in that respect, being Jewish in some ways, I think, kind of hindered realizing I was asexual, because I was already so incredibly different from almost everyone I was around in my day-to-day life that I couldn't tell what things that were different came from being Jewish, came from being I was also the only white person at my high school. Came from being Jewish, came from being white, came from being raised in having a different upbringing, versus being, as I eventually realized, queer, and specifically aro, ace, and non-binary. And all of those were things that I just could not figure out in high school because I was already so weird and so different that, like, it's impossible to pinpoint, oh, this weirdness is because of the orientation shit, and this weirdness is because I'm the only Jew here.
Yeah. So, Kami, actually, when you were answering the question, you kind of led into our next question, which was about relationships. And specifically, I know some of y'all are aro, which maybe this does not apply to you, but in romantic relationships, if you do participate in those, how does being Jewish and ace affect that? Yael, you actually talked about this too, with the like expectations of sex in relationships or lack of sex. So would anyone want to expand on those?
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm actually married. So I am, as you would say, in a romantic relationship.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. I am married to a Jew who is not ace. And because I didn't realize I was ace until I was in college, and I also didn't start dating until I was in college, it took some time for that to become part of the conversation. I think if I had figured out that I was ace when I was younger, that might have affected my dating scene a little bit differently. But it still, even with being married to someone who is completely very understanding, it's still difficult. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, because there were a lot of tears when we discussed it, because it's something that to people who are not asexual is so different. And so it was a conversation a lot, even after we were married already for a year, it was still coming up. And I think that if I had to come out, I have not come out to my parents because I didn't think it was important. I only fully realized I was ace after I already knew I was getting married. So it didn't really seem important. But I think for a Jew who identifies as aromantic and asexual in a community where marriage and having children is pushed from as something that you do the second you turn 18, I think that could be really difficult for people who identify as aromantic and asexual, because you're in a community that's telling you, don't talk about sex. You're not supposed to talk about romance or anything. But then the second you turn 18, it's like, oh, you're getting married and you're having kids. And for people who identify as aro ace, that culture shock and that combination can be really difficult. And I think that on that end, being Jewish does affect that part very, very much.
Yeah. Eliza, I'm sorry, is it Eliza or Eliza?
It's Eliza.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I was saying it right. Go ahead.
All good. Okay, so I've only dated one person. I'm also gay, so it was a girl. And at the time, we were both like, we knew it wasn't going anywhere, and it was kind of just for fun. And it was both of our first relationship, so that definitely like made things interesting, because we're both pretty religious, and we're like, hey, this isn't like the expectation, and also like whatever we think it's okay or not okay or whatever. And we also knew it wasn't going anywhere, so it wasn't like, well, I actually want this for myself, so we're gonna like go all the way kind of thing. But it definitely like made affected things, because like she was like wanted to do certain things, and I was like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, we discussed this first. Like, I'm not comfortable doing it right away. Like I realized I am more sex adverse. But like, if my partner is interested in something and we discuss it first, and then like I can see if I'm more comfortable with it, right? So when she would like just start doing things, I was like, hold on, like I'm so not into this. Like this is way too much. I'd get very overwhelmed and like need a break from even like touching or like looking at her. But it's not like if it's talked through, then it can be okay. And definitely, I think that like right now, I'm not in any relationship and not like I'm not planning on getting married or even having kids. But if it's like talked through, then it can be okay. So when Jewish people are like I have friends who are getting married and adults in my life are just talking about, oh, when you start dating and everything, like it's very expected of me and like it feels very overwhelming. But when it's talked through, it can be a lot better.
Yeah. I'm curious on the having kids part, what y'all think, because in my experience, I always knew I wanted to adopt kids. Like I've always wanted kids, but I never wanted to have them. Even before realizing I was on the spectrum, like that was not something I was interested in, because it seems really painful. But I think it can be interesting in the Jewish community, the expectation of children and specifically raising your children Jewish is really strong, at least in my community. And so I was curious what you all felt about maybe not even just the topic of adoption, but like how would you, if you would have kids, how does asexuality and Judaism affect that for y'all? Yeah, Kami.
Oops, wrong button. So I touched on this briefly, but one thing I didn't say is I have always wanted to be a parent. I've always wanted to. It used to be I wanted to adopt, and now I'd really like to foster. And one of the things is that was a piece of my dysphoria I didn't figure out for the longest time, that the whole having my own kids. And of course, I was seeing all my friends. Just even though it wasn't as big and heavy a overall push in my conservative upbringing as it was to some of my friends who are Orthodox, there was still kind of this expectation. And like my parents had the thing where they never wanted a kid. So my mom never wanted a kid. They got married. They realized they really wanted a kid. So she had a feeling of, oh no, it's going to change for you just like it did for me. And no, what, 4 years older than she was when she changed her mind. But so like I said, part of the question for me was going to be the raising of kids. And one of the things I've thought about a lot is with fostering and begetting an older kid, most likely, and the way that I'd probably want to bring them into my life, but let them make their own choices. And again, I feel very lucky in the community I've ended up with, where I feel like that's going to be actually very lauded rather than a, wait, why are you not just automatically saying you're going to raise them Jewish? And is one of those things I had to grapple with for sure. But when it came to dating also, it's like I'm polyamorous. I'm qua-romantic, which means that platonic and romance kind of get wibbly wobbly. I don't really know. So I am dating a few people, but it took me till my early 30s to figure out the aceness and a little bit longer to figure out the aroness. So they're fairly recent still, in the last about 3-4 years for me. I'm still, it's made my relationships much stronger because now I can go into them knowing and saying these things. But yeah, when it comes to kids, I still definitely had that pressure and had to kind of push it off with the fact that, like you said, I knew I wanted to be a parent, but I always wanted to adopt, never from my body.
Nathan, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, so I've always known that I didn't want kids. I've never ever wanted kids. Partly I don't really like kids. And I've never been interested in engaging with them, and it's just not something that has ever appealed to me in any way. And it's something that has made me feel, especially as I've gotten older, like when I was a kid, it was not something that impacted my relationship with other Jews, because when you're a kid, most other kids aren't really, like, some of them may be hypothetically talking about eventually having kids, but it's not something that's really on anyone's mind, generally speaking. Uh, and but as I got older, in my, in my 20s and now 30s, engaging with other Jews my age is just like, that tends to be one of the main focuses, is having like getting married, having kids. And I see this just in my own family, where all of my cousins are getting engaged, getting married. My sister just had a kid a year ago, and that's all wonderful and amazing for them, but it also is something where it's expected, and to such a degree that it's like I am making a conscious choice not to do it, and B, like, many of my family treats me like I'm a lot younger or less mature or all of these other things, because I'm not progressing in the same way that they are, or I'm not, like, participating in the cycle of life in the same way they are. And that's also something I get when I engage with other that's also something I get when I engage with other Jews, especially Jews who aren't ace, and even other Jews who are queer. It's just, if this isn't something you're prepared to do, if you're not prepared to get married, have kids, join the cycle of Judaism, bringing the next generation into the community, etc., then you're not as much a part of the community. You don't count as much. You're not, like, doing your part. Um, and that's made me feel really disengaged from being Jewish, and that's been hard. So
Anyone else want to comment? Yeah.
So I am both considerably, I mean, not considerably, I don't know everyone's exact age, but seem to be younger than some of the people here. I'm still in my 20s, and I always knew I wanted kids. There was a time where I was really nervous about that, but I do want my own kids. I don't know how my asexuality would affect that, because I'm not sex repulsed. I'm more sex neutral. So to me, that aspect of having kids is whatever, and I'm more scared about all the parts that come after that. But I do want kids, and I think that some people, well, some asexuals don't want kids, or want to adopt or want to foster. I think that it is also normal for asexuals to want to have their own kid. And I think that it can be really confusing, because, to have kids, you have to do something that you might not want to do. And I think that could be really challenging. And just to answer the second half of the question, I do plan on raising my kids surrounded by Judaism.
Absolutely. Yeah, Elisa.
So growing up, the only kids that were around me were like biological kids with their parents. And in my community, it's becoming slightly more accepted to adopt kids, but I don't think I know anyone who's been adopted or fostered or anything. And like all those kinds of situations are always looked down upon more. So in my mind, it was never an option. It's either like, oh, you have kids, like biologically, or you just don't, and that's a big shame if you're not. And I didn't know if I wanted kids. Like when growing up, I loved kids. I know I like them, but I'm like a lot less interested in having my own. And being Jewish is like, oh, it's not an option to adopt. But I think that it's becoming slightly more accepted, and that would be a better thing for me.
Yeah. All right, so our next question is where the anti-Semitism trigger warning comes in. I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble saying that word today. But in ASPEC communities, where do you see anti-Semitism, if you see it? Or vice versa, where do you see anti-asexual sentiment in Jewish communities? Nathan, you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, where I've seen it more than anything else is what I've seen more than anything else is less conscious, purposeful anti-Semitism, and this is just speaking from my own experience, and more not disengaging with cultural Christianity in such a way that you acknowledge that other people have other experiences. So what I mean by that is people who are negative or have or say really negative things about religion generally, or about how religion treats queer people or ace people or in general, and don't bother to interrogate those assumptions, which are generally based on Christianity. Assumptions that, like, there's general things where it's based off of, all of us, I believe, are in the United States, and in the United States as well as in England, Christianity is so embedded as part of the culture that even people who don't think of themselves as Christian, even people who are atheists or who have purposefully disengaged with Christianity, if they were raised Christian or if they weren't raised another religion, they usually haven't bothered to interrogate the way Christianity has shaped how they see things, or the way that they view the world around them. And that impacts, and those kinds of assumptions just generally impact, I think generally impact anyone of a minority religion, including Jews. And it's kind of what I think of as this low-level anti-Semitism. It's not necessarily purposeful, but it kind of grinds away at you because you constantly are feeling like there are these prejudices that people haven't bothered to think about or interrogate. And so that's one thing. The other aspect that I've seen is when people are so this is going to be a religious trauma trigger warning. Pretty much all of my religious trauma came from growing up Jewish surrounded by Christians. Almost none of it came from growing up queer surrounded by anybody of any religion. And so talking to people who assume that religious trauma is based specifically on being queer and Christian, and people who kind of make that underlying assumption of religious trauma is around Christianity rejecting you because of your orientation, instead of thinking about the way that religious trauma impacts those of us. Some of us are going to be impacted by religious trauma no matter what our orientations are. And it might have impacted us well before we had any conception of queerness generally. And my thing is, it's mostly based off of people not interrogating their assumptions and not thinking through the way those assumptions impact others.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I see it a lot. In my own experience, it took me until like very recently to like start actually seeing anti-Semitism in my past and realizing that experiences I had were like low, as you said, low-level anti-Semitism. Like I had a kid in my 3rd grade class try to convert me to Christianity so I wouldn't go to hell. So like,
me too.
Yeah, you don't think. I think as a child, I didn't think anything of that other than it was weird. And as an adult, it like actually really affected me when I started realizing that there were all these things that I had kind of just been like, well, that's part of living in the world when it shouldn't have to be. And so I think your point about the just general distaste for religion that you see a lot in queer communities and in the ASPEC communities, like that can feel very isolating if your religion has actually supported you or not been a source of great trauma. Anyone else would like to share? Yeah, Eliza?
So I haven't seen a lot of anti-Semitism in the ASPEC community just because I'm not like so very involved in the one community, like the community I am a part of is just Jewish aces, but I've seen a lot of aphobia in Jewish communities. Like not all of it's intentional. I remember one time I was listening to like some speech, and like in my community, it's not so accepted for boys to and girls to be mingling and talking and all that. And we like growing up, I've heard a lot like you need to like focus on yourself and don't talk to boys and don't text them and don't call them and don't hang out with them and all that. And there's like a lot of speeches about the dangers of doing that and why you need to wait until you're older and getting married and all that stuff. And I remember one time, like I was listening to one, it was on Zoom during COVID. So I like PM'd the speaker afterwards, and I was just like you're saying that there's no such thing as a platonic relationship and all that, but like as somebody who's aspec, like that's not true. Like I can tell you that there is. And she's like, oh, I don't have time to like address this right now because it was like a public speech, but like call me afterwards. She gave me her number. And I remember I called her and I was explaining myself, and she's like, I think everyone's like that, and you just need to wait until you get married. And she like completely blew me off and said everything I was saying was just, like everyone feels like that. Everyone is really like, like Grace or like Demi. And I was just like, I don't think that's true, like based off of what I've like ever talked to my friends about. And she's like, no, it's fine. You just need to like wait until you start dating. And she just ignored me and sent me into a whole like spiral about that.
Yeah. I'm sorry that happened to you also. That's terrible.
Yeah, to bounce off of that, in the Orthodox communities, it is almost like you're expected to be asexual until you get married, and then all of a sudden you're thrust into something that you don't know anything about, that you learn about in the few months after you get engaged. In Orthodox communities, engagements are also typically pretty short, only a few months. And going from expected to be asexual to all of a sudden being told to have sex can be really jarring for some people. And I think that idea that you're expected to be ace until you're married is harmful to people who are ace and people who aren't, because then when you get married, you think, is there something wrong with me? I've been told that I was normal up until this point, and now I have to change, and I'm not changing, and why is that? And for the reverse, for people who are not asexual, are told their whole life you have to be asexual, and then when they're not, which is also normal to be curious about exploring sexuality, they're shut down, and then that can lead to I guess this is also a trigger warning for emotional trauma, that can lead to emotional trauma after getting married, because your whole life you were told to be asexual, and then all of a sudden you're married, and now it's like, okay, never mind. And I think that and I think that I didn't realize it until very recently, but that is ace phobia, that we're being told, and I guess it's also kind of just queer phobic in general, that you're being told that you have to be asexual, completely binary, don't talk about anything, and then you get married and all of a sudden you have to be heterosexual, you have to be especially the sexual part, you have to all of a sudden be okay with all of these things. And I think that could be really, really confusing. I know that for me, that was a really wild shock of all of a sudden, sex not being talked about at all. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is a thing now. And coming to terms with that it can be pretty difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, Kami.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some of the communities and that some of my Orthodox friends are in, it also feels like from the way some people have talked about it, like once you're married and you're supposed to be having sex, there isn't so much of a emphasis on desire as much as an emphasis on the act as well. So there's, again, this is me relating things from being around my friends who have talked about this or been in these positions. And so there's that kind of also jarringness of where does desire come in that can make things hard and confusing to figure out. Also, when it comes to anti-Semitism in aspec communities, my first thing that came through my mind when Nathan was talking was the term Judeo-Christian. And how often, that gets flung around when it's almost always things that are like purely Christian.
Do you want to explain that term just in case anyone doesn't know?
So Judeo-Christian is a term that's typically used to lump Jews and Christians together because, we both follow parts of the Old versus New Testament. And so there's some conception that, of course, Jews and Christians share a lot in common, which is really not very true at all.
It's particularly used by social conservatives in the United States, especially as justification for why they aren't just imposing Christian values on everyone. They're imposing Judeo-Christian values, which are almost always just Christian values.
And on the vice versa, people fighting against religion will often throw that term around as a look what, these toxic concepts in Judeo-Christianity, which again are almost always Christian. Or, the best parts of Judaism are so freeing and so wonderful, and some of the worst parts are really bad. So sometimes those things will relate to small pockets of the Jewish community, but not most of us also. But that is definitely one of those things, is being in queer spaces. Again, that concept of religion is bad can really be a big part of it. So I just, wanted to bring up that term and the way it gets thrown around as another place that is anti-Semitism without people really realizing it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I was just going to bring up something I was thinking about when bouncing off of what Yael was saying, is something that I've seen, and I don't know as much about modern Orthodox communities, so this is going to be based more on conservative, reform, Reconstructionist Judaism. Something that I've read about, I'm getting a degree in sex education, and one of the things that I've read about is that Judaism tends to be a lot more sex positive than most religions, just in terms of encouraging people to find joy in their sexuality and not condemning it, and find joy in the act. And while that's a really wonderful thing, it's definitely better than being sex negative. There is a point where sex positivity can go in too far in the wrong direction and becomes compulsory sexuality, and where it's not just it's good to find pleasure in sex if that's what you want. It's you should be finding pleasure in sex because God created our bodies to have pleasure. And if you're not finding pleasure in sex, then you're not using God's gift in the way that you're supposed to, which is obviously inherently very aphobic. So that's a whole different aspect of it.
Yeah.
And just to add on to that, in the Jewish Talmud, it does talk about the importance of being attracted to your spouse and wanting that connection. And so what I said before, that you're expected to go from asexual to sexual is true, but then there's also a part where sex is very accepted, and that is just something that, to add to my previous statement, that it is something that it is, I would say, relatively sex positive after you're married.
So we are coming towards the end of our panel, so I want to end us on a positive note. I know this has been asked a lot. Where can Jewish asexuals find other Jewish asexuals to be friends with, to date, to connect with, and form community? I honestly don't have an answer to this. So
yeah, I'm hoping one of y'all has an idea. I've met folks just like in passing, but I've never found a community.
Same.
Yeah, I don't think there's a specific community to like seek out. I am also the only really ace space, Jewish space that I am in. I was told about because I don't even know how it came up. I mentioned I was ace. I was talking to someone about it, and they said, "Oh, I know someone else has this Jewish ace chat. do you want to be in that? And I was like, yeah, sure. And it was really just word of mouth. And I think that needs to change, because I think it's important. I have no idea how that would change, because again, sex is not really something that's talked about. So I think it's a little harder to create that space. But I think it definitely does need to be a space. So if anyone knows how to start spaces like this.
Is this a Jewish ace chat that is open to people? Can you share it with us? Or is it just like
I don't know. I am not one of the admins. I'm not in charge. It started out as a smaller thing. But yeah, sorry.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, I think I guess this is
definitely I've been on that chat since the beginning. We were like 8 people, and now it's like 30 plus or something. So if anyone wants to like contact me after, I'm not an admin, but I can put you in touch with them. Like, it's pretty easy to get on if you just know the right people.
Where can we access your contact info?
I can send my email. Who do I send that to? Like, I don't know where to put it. I can
Are
send
you
it
in
to
the
one
Discord?
of the mods. No, I don't have Discord. Okay. I'll put it on the chat here, and then you can post it on.
Awesome. We will post emails somewhere on Discord, I guess. But yeah, I think in my experience also, this might be the most Jewish ace space I've ever been in. So yeah, I agree. I think that there is definitely a need for that, because there are queer Jewish spaces. If anyone lives in the South, specifically in Atlanta, there's an organization called Sojourn, the Southern Jewish Resource Network, I think. And that's a really great organization, and they do have a lot of space for ace people, something I was involved in back when I lived in that part of the United States. This is a UK conference, so maybe that's not helpful to anyone, but that's all I've got. We have a few minutes left, so I guess I'll ask one last question.
I was gonna say really quick, I swear I remember there being a Facebook group, but I can't find it now. So if anyone has that.
Everybody do some Googling. Do we have time for one last question? If we answer it fast, I think we do. Great. I have 7 minutes. Okay. What is something that you wish you could explain to your younger self, either about asexuality or about Judaism or about both? Kami, was that a...
I guess so. It's really more about aceness, but it took me till my early 30s to figure out aceness, because I had never really seen anything other than sex repulsed ace for quite a while. And then at least it was ace with absolutely no desire at all ever, or demisexual. So I just wish I could go back and tell my younger self, hey, there are other shades of asexuality, like lithosexual, which is what I am. Lithosexual, for anyone who doesn't know, basically means that you'll have sexual crushes, but if the desire is actually returned, most of the time you lose it. So once it's reciprocated, you realize, whoops, nope, not me. Sorry. And so I'd like to be able to tell my younger self, hey, there are more types of asexuality. Stop feeling like an imposter for a good 5 to 10 years about it.
Yeah, I hear that one. Anyone else? Yeah, Elle?
I think this as a message for younger me, and really for anyone who is ace and or Jewish, that things are going to be okay. Things are confusing especially about things surrounding sexuality, and people are becoming more open about it. but it can still be confusing because you're only going off of your own emotions and your own experiences. And even if you hear someone else talk about their experience, there is still, are we feeling the same thing? Is my emotion of X, Y, and Z the same as yours? What does this emotion really mean? And that's normal. It's normal to be conflicted and to question yourself. And I think that it's also important to trust yourself and trust that your emotions are and what they're telling you. I, for a time, was like, maybe I'm bisexual because I felt attracted to men, sexually attracted to men, the same as I did to women. And then I was like, wait, I'm not attracted to women. I'm asexual. And I think that being open to new terms and like Kami, is that your name? Like Kami said, that there are other labels than just, asexual or gay or lesbian, that you can trust your own emotions and your own experiences to help you find where you belong.
Yeah, mine would actually be really similar. Trust your instincts. Like if something feels wrong or off or whatever else, there's a reason for that. If you don't feel comfortable in your body, I would tell myself, if you don't feel comfortable in this situation, in your body, in your experiences in this community, that's a good feeling to trust, and you should find a way to get out of that space. You should find a way you should find a way to change that. And so trust your instincts, and also recognize that that the people around you don't make up the sum of human experiences, and they actually don't know anything. They are children. You are a child, and so are they. They may seem confident, but they don't know anything.
Eliza, if you have one.
Yeah, I would just say, kind of like everyone, and I know it's cliche, but it's gonna be okay, and you have time to figure everything out, and you don't need to be so worried and stressed about it.
Yeah. I think mine is pretty similar to all of yours, but more specifically, words are really great, but you also don't need them. Because I think I spent a lot of time really focused on finding a word that fit me. And what I've realized more recently is that it's okay if there isn't a word for it. It can just be how you are and how you feel. And that's fine. And if words are helpful, because I know labels are very helpful for a lot of people. They were for me. So I think I would say use the labels while you want them, but don't feel afraid to get rid of them if they stop feeling right. And I think that applies to both Judaism and to asexuality. And to everything, really. So anyone have any last remarks they want to share? Awesome. In that case, this has been a lovely panel. I've really enjoyed talking with all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our audience for being here. Have a great day, everyone. Or a great evening. Bye.